Axial Skeleton Martini Chapter 7. Lab Activity 8. Axial Skeleton. Martini Chapter 7. Portland Community College. By 231. Axial Skeleton. Skull. Spine. Thoracic cage. Hyoid bone. Cervical spine. 7 vertebrae. C1 C7. Concave posterior. Thoracic spine. 12 vertebrae. T1 T12. Convex posterior. Attached to the ribs. Lumbar spine. 5 vertebrae. L1 L5. Concave posterior. Sacral spine. 5 fused vertebrae. Sacrum. Coccyx. 4 fused vertebrae. Intervertebral Foraminae. Intervertebral Disk. Annulus Fibrosus. Fibrocartilage. Nucleus Pulposus. Cervical Vertebrae, C3 C7. Vertebral Foramen. Body. Cervical Vertebrae, C3 C7. Bifid Spinous Process. Cervical Vertebrae, C3 C7. Transverse processes. Transverse foramen. Cervical Vertebrae, C3 C7. Superior articular process. Superior articular facet. Cervical Vertebrae, C3 C7. Vertebral arch. Cervical Vertebrae C1, Atlas. Superior articular facet. Cervical Vertebrae C2, Axis. Odontoid process, dens. Cervical Vertebrae C1 and C2 join together. Thoracic Vertebrae. Spinous process. Thoracic Vertebrae. Costal facets on the transverse process, for rib attachment. Lumbar Vertebrae. Body. Sacrum. 5 fused vertebrae. Sacrum. Sacral promontory. Sacrum. Sacral foramina. Sacroiliac Joints. Coccyx. 4 rudimentary vertebrae. Hyoid bone. Greater horn. Lesser horn. Body. Sternum. Manubrium. Sternal angle. Body. Xiphoid process. Ribs 1 to 7, true ribs. Ribs 8 to 10, false ribs. Ribs 11 and 12, floating ribs. Ribs. Ribs attached to thoracic vertebrae. Costovertebral angle. Supraorbital ridge. Frontal bone. Frontal bone. Frontal bone. Frontal bone. Frontal sinus. Parietal bone. Parietal bone. Parietal bone. Parietal bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone. Temporal bone external acoustic meter zygomatic arch mastoid process. Mandibular fossa. Styloid process. Temporal bone. Carotid canal. Jugular foramen, occipital bone. Occipital bone, occipital condyles foramen magnum external occipital. Protuberance. Sphenoid bone, lesser wing greater wing pterygoid process. Lateral pterygoid plate. Medial pterygoid plate. Sphenoid bone. Spheroidal sinus. Pterygoid process. Sphenoid bone. Lesser way. Greater way. Salatoceca, sphenoid bone. Hypophyseal fossa. Dorsum cella, ethmoid bone. Cristogalli. Perpendicular. Plate, ethmoid bone. Middle nasal conchae. Perpendicular plate. Ethmoid bone. Cristogalli. Cribriform. Plate. Perpendicular plate. Cranium floor, anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa. Posterior cranial fossa. Sagittal suture between the right and left parietal bones, occipital. Frontal bone. Coronal suture between the parietal bones and the frontal bone. Temporal bone. Occipital bone. Squamous suture between the parietal bone and the temporal bone. Frontal bone. Between the parietal bone and the temporal bone. Temporal bone. Occipital bone. Lambdoid suture between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. Frontal bone. Between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. Temporal bone. Occipital bone. Wormian, sutural bones. Small islands of bone that fill gaps and sutures. Present in varying amounts. Fetal skull. Fetal skull superior view. Orbit. Maxilla. Hard palate. Mandible, ramus, angle body, coronoid process, mandibular condyle. Alveolar process. Ramus. Angle. Mental foramen. Body. Mandible. Mandibular. Foramen. Mylohyoid line, palatine bone. Voma. Zygomatic bone. Temporal process. Zygomatic arch. Facial bones. Facial bones, middle nasal conchae, ethmoid, inferior nasal conchae. Perpendicular plate, ethmoid. Voma, sinuses. Ethmoid ear cells. Frontal. Sternidal. Maxillary.